So, for the past month, I've had the opportunity to interview three really passionate and hardcore collectors in the sports card space. My reason for doing so is I have loved making videos here on YouTube, and hopefully, you've seen a few before. And I always try to share information, but the problem with me is I've only been around for 3 years. So, yes, while I have some great information to share, a lot of the stuff I've learned is fairly recent, while there's people out here who have been doing this for decades. So, from doing these interviews, there's a lot of themes that overlap between these different collectors. I've consolidated 5 of them here today to discuss, and I hope that they're helpful to you guys as a listener or viewer. So, from all three collectors so far that I've interviewed on my podcast, I will say they all heavily focus and collect on cards that do not pop up. And when I say do not pop up, I mean like hardly ever. Like you're seeing cards in their collection that sell maybe once over the lifetime of the set, or cards that have never seen a public sale. There's definitely some that sell fairly often, but you get my point here. So to share the Mount Rushmore of some of these collections, I'm just going to step through them here. In my first interview with Brett, he had some incredible cards. A couple highlights here being an Andrew Luck 1 of 1 out of 2014 Prism, a Super Fractor Roman Reigns 1 of 1, again 1 of 1, never pops up, and then a Peyton Manning X Fractor out of 2002 Finest. Now what's funny about this card is I have spent so much time trying to find one, have never seen one, and again, Brett happened to have one, so it kind of fits that theme of cards that just never pop up. And then finally, a Marvin Harrison 1 of 1 out of Flair Showcase. Next, I interviewed Paul, and the theme stayed the same. All 4 cards that he was very passionate about and shared that he enjoyed collecting were just never cards that ever seemed to pop up. So you had a Peyton Manning out of Fleer Brilliance, the 24 karat gold. You had an Ichiro Suzuki, Fleer EX Essential Credentials. Paul shared that story. Just sounds like a card that's impossible to find in general. And then, of course, the LeBron James Black Refractor. How can you forget about that one? Out of 2003 Topps Chrome, rookie card LeBron. We've all seen these pop up, and the auctions go crazy. But again, sometimes you get those dry spells with this card, even though it's very highly numbered, because a lot of them end up in collections and they never see the light of day. And finally, the Alex Ovechkin Green PMG out of 10. Again, card you just never see, fetches very high dollar amounts. And finally, the third collection we got to see was from Chris. You know, he had the 1 of 1, arguably the best card for Nikola Jokic, who is arguably the best player in the NBA today. And we had a Michael Jordan Precious Metal Gems Red, just gorgeous card, probably my favorite looking card in existence. And you had the Christian McCaffrey Black Prism 1 of 1. And finally, the Luka Gold Prism 2018 out of 10. So you're probably asking, what does it matter the fact that these guys collect cards that never pop up? I'll give you my takeaway and how I'm going to apply this to my collecting moving forward, and I hope it's helpful for you guys as well. The real reason I think a collector benefits from collecting cards that never pop up is your cards are always in demand, right? You don't have a card that's out there in circulation with 100,000 copies. There's 1,000 listed on eBay. That's not the type of cards that I want to be collecting, and it seems like these three don't either. They're the type of cards that are literal grails for people, right? They're ghost cards that don't exist. If you want to look for them, they're not going to appear. When they happen to appear, the auctions are probably going to go very high and be tough to find because there's so many collectors fighting over these cards. And I don't like to use the word investment too often on here, but I think all this kind of ties into the investment side of your collection, is just really buying cards and focusing on cards that are very high demand for collectors and also just in general hard to find. Now the other thing, again, how I'm going to take this and apply to my collection. Yes, all of the cards I'm showing are very high value for a lot of them, but let's say I'm a collector and I want to start collecting Chris Johnson, a running back, a fantasy football legend. Now, are his cards, the 1 of 1s, the out of 10s, going to be $100,000? No, they're not. They're actually going to be fairly reasonable. And I've talked with a lot of collectors who collect in niche spaces and have very passionate, large collections around specific teams and players. And they follow this same logic. They go after cards that apparently don't exist because they never pop up. And it's the most fun doing it because you have to really hunt for those cards. So I think that's, I guess, in a high level, my takeaway from what the collectors that I've interviewed are doing and how I'm going to take and apply that to my collection, regardless of the level or type or popularity of the player that I'm looking for. And part of this, is maybe if you're looking for a modern guy or a slightly older guy, maybe from mid 2000s, maybe you start looking for the out of 10s and you pay the $100 instead of paying the $20 for the out of $199. Just hypothetically, I'm thinking of Topps Finest when I say this, but there's a lot of other sets that this kind of logic applies to. But like I said, maybe it makes sense to just save up, go for that super rare one that you're never going to see again, instead of buying 5 or 6 smaller ones that pop up fairly often and you can go buy again if you wanted to. The next lesson I've learned so far from interviewing these three collectors was that they heavily prioritize making relationships. All three touched on this very in depth in my interviews without me even intending to bring it up. With Paul, again, I touched on his 24 karat gold Peyton Manning that I shared a second ago. With that card, from the story he shared, he would not have found or had the opportunity to pick up that card without knowing another collector who reached out to him, who was well aware that Paul would be already interested in that type of card. And I think that's where it's very important to make sure other people are aware of what you collect, whether that is on Instagram or at your local card show or card shop. Make people aware of what you're looking for so that you get reached out to when these rare cards do pop up. The other theme I felt with a lot of this, and again, it kind of ties into the Nikola Jokic pickup, you have to foster the relationships with the people you do buy from. So if someone reaches out to you, if they offer you a chance to pick up a card, and again, I think he even touched on this with the Christian McCaffrey one-of-one when I talked to him. Be respectful. Don't fight or argue over the extra $100. If it's a card you want that doesn't pop up, pull the trigger, treat the person well who reached out to you, because in the future, that's how you're going to get the leads on these super rare cards that they might come across. If you have that mindset that, hey, this might be a person I want to deal with again in the future, I think they're going to help me get cards in my collection. Maybe I can help them find cards for their collection. And I think that's a really satisfying part of this hobby, is just meeting others and kind of growing and fostering these relationships. Get that network of people out there who are hunting for you and you're hunting for them. That's been super fulfilling on my side of things, even just by making this YouTube channel, for instance, right? I've shared many times that I'm looking for the top's finest gold refractors for Peyton Manning. There are literally a handful that I would not have had the shot at, would never have seen were available without you, the viewers, reaching out to me. So a huge thank you to that. And just in general, another example of why this is so important. Now, the final point on this one I want to make, and this ties to Brett Stacking Slabs, who was my first guest on the podcast. He's a big proprietor of working deals with your friends and people you meet, acquaintances in the hobby, versus going online and buying them. Now, reason being, you're not paying all these taxes and shipping, number one. Number two, you're just dealing with a person that you're familiar with and you're growing a relationship with. And they're going to help you get those cards again that are likely locked away in collections, and I see a lot of the cards that Brett picks up. So I saw recently, for instance, Brett was going after the Panini Contenders Cracked Ice. They're all numbered out of 23 for both Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck. Now, what's interesting about this is I'm aware that many of those are locked away in collections. So the way Brett was able to complete his set was just by knowing people in the hobby who had these cards, who knew what he was going after, and he worked out very easy deals with them, and I saw this from his posts recently. So these are just a few examples of why I think it's super important to prioritize relationships, and the fact is I'm seeing these collectors doing this, and I have a feeling the future collectors I talk with, the story is going to be the same. For the third lesson here that I've learned, I'm going to get a little philosophical. Bear with me. Trust me, I'm going to get to a point here. The collectors I've chatted with, and even just in general, people I've seen that are successful in the hobby, they enjoy the process first and foremost. So they're living in the sports cards every day, right? They're living in the present. I don't feel a sense of lack, a sense of, I need this card to be happy. A lot of the collectors that I've talked with already, they every day enjoy their cards. They look at their collection and say, wow, these are awesome cards. I love spending time with them, which again sounds weird. It sounds like you're hanging out with a friend. But it's literally what these people do. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's great. That's easy to do when you have $100,000 cards or you have, these crazy collections. But I'd argue it's even more important before you get to that point. And I would guess, if I had to throw this out there, that these collectors always enjoyed their cards. They always stopped and looked at their cards they had and enjoyed them. Not that they're not setting goals to chase down these, again, like I mentioned, these grail, these impossible to find cards. I'm sure their goals are there, but they're not sitting day to day just thinking about it, simmering on it. I bet you anything, they're enjoying the cards they have and trying to foster, again, the day-to-day process in their collection, in their business, in the way they go about the hobby. I think this kind of applies too to what I've tried to do in the hobby, where if you've seen my content on YouTube, I always try to share, I'm not some person making $1 million a year. I started with the amount of money that I was putting in every month. I bought cards, I graded. I bought cards, I graded. I kept cycling that. And then, after a few months, I quit putting money in. I kind of let that keep going. I'll grade 50 cards, keep 5 of them, sell the other 45, so those are free, right? You've heard my spiel before. But where this ties into this point is the fact that I continually try to invest in the process, right? I really try to enjoy the simple things, the prepping cards for grading, the listing on eBay. It sounds crazy. It sounds, a little hard to believe, but I love every step of the process. Now, if I didn't fall in love with the process, would I be sitting here with this huge eBay store that gets a little overwhelming sometimes? No, I definitely wouldn't. And, the fact is, the fact that I put that work in, the hours spent that nobody sees, at night prepping cards or shipping cards early in the morning before work, that is what led me to the point where I can start to acquire and work down the path where I can get to be in the point of, these three collectors I've talked to already, where they have these just absurd collections and they love it. And it's just so much passion you feel. And that's, again, the path I hope to be walking down. And every day I'm going to try to live in this process. And you guys have to keep me accountable. If I start complaining about shipping on eBay, you got to shoot me a message on Instagram, say, Austin, you got to chill out, man. Keep doing your thing. I did want to also throw this out. My inspiration for this one, off of the fact, again, that I had heard this as a theme, was a podcast I listened to recently by Ed Milet. He touched on our addiction to achievement. And the fact is, the more we focus on the things we need to quote unquote be happy, and you see the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm going to reach it and then I'll be happy. As humans, you can do more research on this if you want, but as humans, our biggest excitement is actually in the hunt, in the process, in the working through the different steps to get to our goal. When we get the goal, there's actually a huge fall off of, dopamine and the things that make us feel happy. So if you can identify that and focus on the fact that, yeah, I might not have these $1,000 cards, but I have 10 cards that I'm really happy about, and here's how I'm going to get to these other cards. I think that's what can really help us, quote unquote, level up in the hobby more than anything. So the fourth lesson I've learned from talking to three passionate collectors is that they all have a very long time horizon. So what I mean by this is they're not actively sitting and checking their card prices every day. They're not sitting here and worrying if they buy a card for their collection and it goes down in value in the short term. And I think there's a few reasons for this. First and foremost, they're collecting cards that they absolutely love, they believe in the long run, and ultimately they're not looking to sell currently in, really any regard unless they have to, unless there's that card that pops up that they're never going to see again. I got that theme from Brett and from Paul that sometimes, although we are collectors, you have to let cards go if you want to get that one that you really need, or if life pops up. Paul even talked about selling cards to be able to go on a vacation with his family and how great of a feeling that was. I think that all ties into this whole thing where if we're sitting here sweating and worrying about the price of our cards, what the market's going to do, what happens when Fanatics takes over, we really lose sight of the long run of why we're here, some of the obvious benefits of having a big collection and the joys of it, because we're just sitting so stressed about what if in the future instead of being present in the moment and understanding that you're in this for the long run. A specific example I'm thinking of right now that I'm going to share is from Chris and the interview with him. Again, I mentioned he has the number one, arguably, Nikola Jokic card that there is, which is the Prism Black 1/1 from his rookie year. Now, that card from the interview, I didn't get any sense from Chris that, hey, Jokic goes and wins this championship, that he has any interest in selling, which I think is so awesome. A lot of what you see online is the highlights of, I bought this, I sold it for that amount, I made this amount of money. But the fact of the matter is, these guys I've interviewed, they don't care about that. They want these cards for the long run. Chris believes Jokic is going to be the statistical all-star and just superstar for the next decade. So the fact of the matter is, he just loves owning the card of his. He's not looking to sell it. He has a super long time horizon and knows his end game is to collect these crazy cards. So there's no point to stop and say, oh, the card might have went up, I'm going to go sell it. He truly enjoys the card more than anything. And additionally, that tied in with my talk with Paul, right? He had a 2003 Topps Chrome Black Refractor LeBron James. It was a PSA 8 rookie card for him. Now, I did ask him, I said, Paul, when the market went kind of crazy in 2021, was there any interest in selling that card? And he was very clear. He said this. I'm going to try to quote him. I might not get exact. Something along the lines of, he said, well, Austin, everyone told me to sell at $5,000. They told me to sell at $10,000. They told me to sell at $20,000. But he's sitting here today with this card. And I think the point being is he believes in the market in the long run. He loves collecting. He never sat in a sense of, oh my gosh, I missed out on all this money that I could have sold, right? Because he just frankly doesn't care because he's in it for the long run. These are more than just investments for these people. Their passion, their nostalgia. When they look at them, they feel the memories with that player. And I think just falling in love with that side of thing is my takeaway here. Collecting the cards you believe in for the long run, that you enjoy, that you want to own, and to not sweat the short game here. The fifth and final takeaway I have here from these discussions, and this one's really important, they're not afraid to trade up for a big card. So I'll specifically touch on my talk with Chris, but the other two definitely had themes of this, of trading up for cards. Chris touched on the fact that he had collected Jordan inserts greatly. He had a 2-row box, you're talking your Jambalayas, just a really rare inserts of the 90s. And on the flip side, a little later on, he did the same with Luka Doncic. So he collected all these different cards and absolutely loved it. But when the opportunity arose to pick up two of the best cards for both Jordan and Luka, he jumped on it. He sold the huge box of cards that he had worked towards for both players in order to buy the quote unquote, again, the grail, the card that doesn't pop up. For the two guys he loves the most, he was willing to trade up and sell a ton of cards to upgrade into one. Now, personally, I've dealt with this a little bit as well. I've really dwelled more in the zone of, let's say, $100 to $500 cards. It's where I've had a lot of fun. I feel confident buying those type of cards where I'm not too worried. But I've ran into this lately as well, where I've really started to look back on my collection and stop and say, okay, we're getting over 100 cards. There's going to be a lot here. What can I consolidate? What can I turn into maybe one big card, right? If I have 60 Peyton Mannings, maybe there's 20 I'm willing to let go to go buy a Prism Gold, to go buy a super rare card that I'm not going to see again. Because when these cards do finally pop up, again, like I touched on, the type of quality of cards where they don't go to market, you don't see them sell. But when they do, you have to be ready. And I feel like up until this point in these discussions, it's never really been a thought of mine to be ready for when the card pops up. It's always like, oh crap, I can't afford it. That's fine. But I'm getting to the point now where I really would rather have one card instead of 20. So that's kind of my takeaway here is maybe it's time to reevaluate and look at some of these. Am I going to sell every card? No, right? But if there's some that kind of stand out as less meaningful to me or I get less enjoyment out of, maybe it is time to start evaluating, really look at upgrading into one big card. So thanks so much for joining again. My name's Austin. I really appreciate that you took the time to tune in here today, and I hope you all enjoyed.